Hello, and welcome to History on Blast, episode 15. Whose Pope is it anyway? I'm Hillary, and I'll be your host, as this week, we're gonna put the papacy on blast for a giant clusterfuck at the end of the 1300s known as the Western Schism. But first, this month in history. On December 16th, 1773, the citizens of Boston, largely the Sons of Liberty, decided to stage a little tea party, which in this case is slang for dumping a shipment of tea overboard in Boston Harbor as an act of protest against the ever-increasing taxes levied by the British Crown, despite the fact that the colonies had little to no representation in Parliament. The tea party went off without a hitch, despite the fact that they briefly thought one man had died. He'd been hit on the head with a crate of tea, but it was okay. He woke up later. Alright, so let's talk about the Western Schism, also known as the Papal Schism, the Great Occidental Schism, and the Schism of 1378. Basically, it was a split in the Catholic Church going from 1378 to 1417, in which there were not one, not two, but in fact three separate popes, which is why I call this period Whose Pope Is It Anyway?, where the rules are made up and the excommunications don't matter. Basically, this starts in 1378, aptly enough, when they decided that the papacy should move back to Rome, because, the location of the papacy is really weird and convoluted, because really, if you think about it, it should probably be, anywhere near where the religion started, but that's a bigger clusterfuck and starts getting into, Middle Eastern history and the Crusades and all of that, and then you get, that whole thing with Constantinople, and I've gotten into Constantinople before, and I can't go back to Constantinople. But, anyway, so the papacy ends up in Rome, and then for a little while it went to Avignon in France for some reason. And then under Pope Gregory XI, they decided the papacy should go back to Rome. Well, in 1378, the people of Rome started rioting in the streets because they wanted an Italian pope and not a French one. Because I guess they were sick of that. Whatever. So they decided to elect Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, who named himself Urban VI and became Pope. He was from Naples, and they thought that was perfectly fine. He's not Roman, but he'll do. Sure, he's at least Italian. Well, then they decided that this guy was crazy. He was really suspicious. He was kind of paranoid. He had these violent outbursts of temper. And he was also a reformist, which was not a thing they were fond of, especially coming off the years of French rule. They really wanted somebody who was, kind of a hardline, old school Roman Pope. And then they got this guy. So they're like, okay, we're just gonna move out of Rome and elect a new pope, I guess. Even though that's absolutely not how this works. According to the rules, you're only supposed to be able to elect a new pope if the old pope either quits or dies. And there had never really been a pope quitting until recently. Generally speaking, it was the pope dies. By whatever means are close to hand. So they decided, all right, we're gonna elect a new pope in September, even though that's absolutely not how this works. And they elect Robert of Geneva, who takes the name Clement VII. Also, just mentioning it here, this is where things start getting very complicated, because you now have two popes, each with their own line of succession, and each of them is trying to excommunicate the other. And then they decided that two popes was clearly not enough, and we got Pope number 3. And somewhere in here also, alright, So, Urban the Sixth and Clement the Seventh both died, and now we have Boniface the Ninth and Benedict the 13th, and then they get a third pope, which is Alexander the Fifth, and then he dies and gets replaced with John the 23rd. So, just to make sure that we're all following along with who is still on the stage, we have Boniface the Ninth, Benedict the 13th, and John the 23rd. Okay. So now it is 1410. Everyone is royally sick of the fact that there are 3 popes, which goes against all of the rules, and they're basically standing there in a triangle going, no, I excommunicated you first. No, I excommunicated you. And that's basically how everything's been going. And they're like, oh my god, I almost want the corruption of Avignon back, because this is a clusterfuck. And they decide, okay, we're going to have a council, because that's what you do in the Catholic Church when you have a problem. So they get, so John the 23rd convenes a council, because they're like, okay, this is a mess. And they get, Gregory the 12th, who is now on the stage, and I really don't know when he showed up, but he's a pope too. Pretty sure there's still 3. Don't know who died. Somebody did. And they're like, all right, we're going to have a council with all of these bishops, and we're going to figure out who is the pope, and some people are going to resign, and some people are going to be actually excommunicated, and this one is going to count, no, really. And then they're like, all right, we are now going to support, as of 1417, we all support Pope Martin V, despite the fact that none of you have heard of him up until this point. Martin V is now the Pope. And at this point, the crown of Aragon went, cool council, still not Pope, because they were continuing to support Benedict the 13th, who was their anti-pope, but he'd been excommunicated by the other popes. And at this point, they're like, okay, we can't keep doing this, France. And the archbishops loyal to Benedict the 13th were like, la la la, we can't hear you. And when Benedict the 13th dies, they voted in Benedict the 14th, and then they voted in Clement the 8th. But at that point, the schism was basically over, and Clement the 8th resigned in 1429 and finally went, okay, fine, Martin the 5th can be Pope, I guess. So then they decided, all right, now we have to figure out what on earth happened here, how we're going to record it in history, and what the legitimate line of popes is, because that is very important. Catholicism has this thing about the succession of popes and the legitimate line of popes that has to go down. Basically, they're like, yeah, no, this absolutely goes all the way back to, I think, St. Peter. Definitely don't quote me on that, because I just pulled that out of my ass, but I'm pretty sure it goes back to St. Peter, or maybe Paul. They're all basically named Peter and Paul. So they're like, okay, what's the actual legitimate line of succession? And then Pope Pius II was like, no, we're not going to make it so that anybody else can change who the Pope is once you've declared a Pope other than the Pope. Are we good now? And they're like, yeah, but what about the succession? And then they continued to argue about what the legitimate line of popes was until the 1800s. Remember, this ended, technically, in 1429. They argued for 400 years about what the actual accurate legitimate line of succession was of the Pope. They did eventually resolve all of that, though, and Urban VI and his successors were declared to be the legitimate ones, although the Pisan popes were sort of acknowledged in that, up through the 1900s, other popes would take their regnal name in the sequence after them, such as the Borgia Pope Alexander VI, who took his regnal name in sequence after the Pisan Alexander V. Also, interestingly enough, Gregory the XII, who resigned in 1415, was the last pope to resign until Benedict XVI in 2013. So basically, the Western Schism was a clusterfuck because a bunch of people couldn't make up their minds about who was pope today. They've pretty well solved this one, that everything is very well hammered down as to how the pope is elected and who has the power to remove a pope and all of that. Basically because in the 1400s, after all of this happened, they went, holy shit, we don't want to do that again? Because really, who wants to stand around going, I'm excommunicating you for like 40 years? So that's going to be it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed what you're hearing. If you are, be sure to rate and review on iTunes. You can also leave comments on the website if iTunes isn't your thing. If you have any questions, comments, clarifications, feedback, anything at all, even if you just want to chat, literally anything, you can always find me at History on Blast on Twitter or historyonblast@gmail.com if you'd like to send an email. If you've got any stories about the weird local history from where you're from, you can always send those in. I'm definitely still looking forward to doing a listener roundup episode someday if I can get that wacky history from you. As always, thank you for Defy Them All for the use of their song Keeper of Histories for the intro and outro of our program. And as always, thank you.